starting part 2 of our climate change, ecology, in the Arctic environment panel. And the first speaker today will present a report titled Macromorphological Analysis of Cryolithogenetic Sediment in Arctic and Subarctic Regions, presented by Anna Kut at the Melnikov Permafrost Institute of the Siberian branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Yakutsk. So, Anna, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Just give me 1 second.
Sure.
Everyone can see my presentation?
Yes.
And I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, and I would like to start. And I would like to start from what kind of the method of macromorphological analysis of deposits is widely used by specialists in various fields like geology, geography, for analyzing the deposition environment, what kind of source, environment, and material transportation type, and distance, of course. The method is based on the assertion that each environment through which the material passes leaves traces on the particle surface that are uniquely characteristic of it. Elements of the effect of mechanical and chemical processes, such as the shape, degree, roundness of grains, and a set of diagnostic elements on the surface of particles. Particle surface transformation is going gradually, and during accumulation, particles acquire new elements corresponding to this environment. Various researchers have collected a great volume of material on diagnostic features characteristic of fluvial, like this line, marine, lacustrine, and glacial deposits. Macromorphological study of the surface, particle surface, has several aspects. And first, it is the study of the shape and roundness of the particles. Roundness is the degree of smoothness of the shape of particle during transportation and redeposition. It shows the conditions, range, and duration of the transfer. Thus, the sediments of glacial deposits are characterized by angular outlines, a sharp edge, and the wind brings the particle to a perfectly rounded shape and makes the surface matte. For the analysis of grains, we consider the concept of matting of surface. One of the classifications based on Conference's assessment of roundness and matteness was developed by Kaye, and it was after modified Voronka. Here we can see 7 types of grains, RM, EM, RM, and so on. And for example, RM, it's eye-line well-rounded grains, and the surface of these grains is matte usually. And for example, grains of EL type, it's grains of high energy aqueous environment, and it's usually well-rounded grains, and surface is shiny. In Russia, we have classification of Habakov, and he just separated grains on 5 types, from 0 to 4 non-rounded fragments and very well-rounded grains. And it's a problem that in Russia and abroad we have different classification, and sometimes it's very complicated to compare, to use the material together. but we are in process to find some decision of that. Second aspect, it's thanks to more than a century of researches, the relationship between the nature of the particle surface and the formation of deposits has been completely established. And it has been proved, for example, that when transported in a suspended state in dynamic water flow, the particle acquire dissected relief with smoothed outlines, a glossy surface, and a shallow microrelief on concave parts, and so on. And on this picture, you can see some elements on surface. It's like conchoidal fractures. Usually this element characterizes fluvial environment, and how many of these elements we have on surface, we can say that it's very dynamic regime, or it's like very slow flow river stream, and so on. For example, this kind of element like flat cleavage surfaces, parallel striations, linear steps, it's for usually we characterize it glaciers, glacier environment like this. Abrasion features, it's for fluvial environment, V-shaped precision cracks. And this surface usually we say that it's from line environment. And of course, we have not only mechanical processes, we usually we can see chemical, for example, chemical weathering steps or cracks, adherent particles, and for example, florital localization. Very nice picture on the surface. And using this method, and as you can see in this table, for each environment, we have the complex of elements which are characterized only for this environment. And using this method, we analyzed some profiles in Yakutia. One of that is borehole, profile of borehole, which situated on Avalanche plate in central Yakutia. And what we can say here, quartz sand grain and sealed grain macromorphological analysis was undertaken by scanning electron microscope, SEM, for this borehole. Based on the result, a conclusion can be reached that the deposits accumulation took place as a result of multiple retransportation events, recycling the same material while introducing a limited supply of new material into the fluvial environment. We can say it just using these graphs. There you can see the distribution of different genetic type of grains, like it's broken just from a bedrock, for example, grains of fluvial, from fluvial environment, and so on. And afterwards, we can make more detailed analyze using the complex of elements on surface. And what we can see, for example, the complex one in lower part of borehole. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. That the most common abrasion features like V-shaped precision cracks and crescentic judges. These features addition with corrosion microtextures indicate an aqueous environment. Additionally, the presence of microtexture comprising breakage blocks on the most concave part of EM-EL groups grains indicates that the sediment transport took place in a fluvial setting. That's I said before. This type of breakage blocks is a result of individual V-shaped precision cracks overlapping, and we can just suggest that it was a sediment of pre-Lena river. The next complex of this borehole, it's accumulation of this sediment took place during Ms. 6-8, and this period is characterized by the cessation of the ice complex formation and increase of sedimation rate. They differ from those of the complex 1, and they are characterized by the decrease of fluvial activity. We say it because we have these parallel ridges, and we have these conchoidal fractures on the surface, and we have a lot of angular grains in composition. Sand-sized grains in deposits of the complex 2. This one characterized by a high degree of rounding and a smooth and glossy surface. We have V-shaped precision cracks, but it's not a widespread. It hasn't widespread distribution on the grain surface. And among the texture diagnostic elements, the solution surfaces and arc-shaped steps prevail. Concordal fractures are features preserved from the previous environment. And complex 3, it's a little bit upper of profile. It's sediments of a lake. We see that we can make mineralogical analysis as well, and it shows that feldspar content is higher than quartz, and additionally deposits representing lake environment have a silt-size grain. Therefore, most silty-size quartz grains are angular with sharp edges, as you can see on these pictures, and large conchoidal fractures on surface. Grains with light and blade shapes prevail. Effects of abrasion in current-dominated settings have not been observed on the grain surface. It's elements of island and fluvial environment. This complex analyzed in this complex, all analyzed grains have a coated surface with a very thin jagged coating on about 85% of the grains. Such feature suggested that most of them have only one source. The probable lake was supplied by non-coated grades with a fresh fraction directly from rock weathering or from large quartz grain. Now, for example, it could be abrasion in fluvial environment. The next complex of this borehole, we can say that in deposits, feldspar and carbonates prevail, suggesting change of clastic source in comparison to the fine-grained complexes 2 and 3 below, and probably other type of transport was responsible for supplying material. Quartz and feldspar grains have the same roundness and the same degree of coating. Probably grains were derived by airline processes, but we suggested because of the most popular theory from literature. This question we should study a little bit more. Moreover, different size of silty grains composed analyzed ice complex deposits suggested different distance from each material were transported. And the next profile that we studied. It was in 2015. It's a profile of Kızılsır Massif complex or dune complex. It's situated in Viluy Basin, Viluy River Basin, and it's very interesting object for us because it's like desert in a permafrost region. And using this methods, the profile of this dune massif in Viluy Basin we studied, and identified diagnostic signature indicate both aquatic and alkaline sedimentary environments, mechanical disintegration of bedrock fragments, and cryogenic weathering as well. Among them, aquatic and alkaline processes were predominant. And I just want to say a little bit more that the results of micromorphological analysis fit in the scenario and of evolution of this massif, which comprises two stages. The first is and the first stages is related to the latest late Pleistocene and characterized by significant climate changes. It was formed in Paleo-Viluy Basin, and this part is formed in has formed. Oh, I'm sorry, it was formed in fluvial stream. And the next two parts, you can see this horizon. It separated this complex on two parts. It's alkaline complex, but it's from this part was formed in Holocene, and this part it was formed in Sartan. I just but it's alkaline because we have this very well-rounded grains, and these special elements on the surface are like Crescentic judges, and just a little bit some more elements. And I would like to say that the macromorphological analysis led to make reconstruction of sedimation environment on the last stages of accumulation, and it gives new additional material for paleogeographic estimation of sediment transformation within the permafrost area. And I just would like to say that this method we can use only in the complex of genetic and fat cell methods because it works only in complex. And my further investigation will be forward on reconstruction of sediment accumulation environment within the ice complex regions and frost weathering processes and sediment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your report. We don't have time for questions, unfortunately. We need to move on, but if anyone has questions to Anna about the implications of her research or practical application, feel free to drop them into questions and answers box. Anna, if you stay with us a little bit, you can also check the box yourself, and if you see a question, you can reply to it. And this, we're moving to the next report, titled Global Warming and Ice Melting in the Arctic, from the Phenomena to Legal Implications, presented by Sakshi Mankotia from the Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi. Go ahead.
Thank you, Fulbright Program and all the panelists. So I'm going to share my screen now. Is it visible?
Yes.
So my name is Sakshi Mankotia. I'm a research scholar from Department of Geography, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. So I'm going to talk about the Arctic global warming effect and the phenomena to legal implication. So as we all know that Arctic is under great threat from environmental stress, largely originating in distant regions from late 1970s to the 2000, Arctic summer sea ice has declined more than 10% per decade. So the report from IPCC has already given us evidence of the probability of warming the climates, like 90% probability from anthropogenic greenhouse gases emission. So there are sufficient reasons to believe that changes contribute in snow melting and rising sea level. The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the globe. And these changes are already affecting biodiversity, human and worst altogether. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the reasons for the ice melting. So our study area is Novaya Zelmia, outcomes and influences and changes for the furthermore effective for the implication. So this is the outline of my presentation. So the question is why this is very important. The change of snow, water, ice, and permafrost will have a significant impact on Arctic freshwater and near shoreline marine system. Further, climate change in the polar regions will produce feedbacks effect that will have global significance consequence over the next 100 years. So what are the reasons that global warming, ice sea melting is happening? So we have sorted out three reasons, which is first the warm water from the Bering Sea and how the world is warming and the heat source inside the earth. So warm water from the Bering Sea through satellite photos of the melting of Arctic has shown the actual measurement made by scientists in the Bering Sea and the Bering Strait. Scientific analysis made comparison have proven that warm water from the Bering Sea enters the Arctic Ocean through the Bering Strait. This is an important factor in the rapid melting of Arctic ice and a source of heat. The warm currents that form in form of warm pools north of the equator, global warming and solar radiation have only just helped. So how the world is really warming? The world's dominant view is that industrialization is a result of greenhouse gases, which causes the Earth to lose less heat. I think that's one of the reasons. Perhaps the more important is a warm pool near the equator of the world's ocean, which forms warm currents, warm of the oceans and the warm in the atmosphere as well. So where does that heat come from? One is the internal ocean coming out and the exterior of that, which is the solar radiation. Solar radiation changes little and the area of the warm pool location, the interannual changes is more obvious. In the Pacific, during the La Nina effect, the warm pools are smaller and farther from the north. And during the El Nino effect, the warm pool is located the east and has a larger area. So what are the heat resources inside the Earth? One is the residual heat from the Earth's interior, and other is the heat generated by the fission radioactive material. So man-made Earth neutron sources such as nuclear power plants, leaks form of radioactive substances on the Earth interior and exterior radiation intensify will have a certain influence on the neuron source of the increase will cause the Earth interior and exterior radiation fission. The release of atomic energy increases the internal and external ocean temperature rise, then the internal and external seawater pool temperature also increases with impacting the atmosphere temperatures, which is also part of it. So small changes in the speed of rotation and also changes in the size of the contribution forces, which help in the amount of the hot water to come out of the ocean. And since it reach the ocean surface, resulting in the changes in the size of location and the warm pools ocean created by La Nina and effect. So this is the case study of the Novaya Zemlya area. So Novaya Zemlya composed of two major islands, Northern Serene Islands and the Southern Yuzhny Islands, separated by the Macromorphological stage based on the census 2010. The population is 2,429. So during the Cold War, the area was militarized and was primarily used for the logistic support of the nearby nuclear testing sites. The region also is one of the most important part of the nuclear testing sites. From 1954 to 1990, islands of the Novaya Zemlya conducted atmospheric and underground testings of the nuclear test. Also, it also been part of the decommissioned nuclear weapons and were scrutiny to ground in Ireland, turning the entire region into an environmental disaster zone. So we used two time period satellite data image of 1992 and 2016, Landsat 5TM from May to June in 2016 and Landsat AOLI from June to July. We have taken the normal differential snow indices used to calculate the IC area of the region. Further, we use the Google Earth engine to calculate the band and analysis images with the help of NDCI indices. So what were the results we got from this? So the result was in 1992, the ice cover area is calculated as 63,563 square kilometer. That's the 70% of the total area. Whereas in 2016, the calculated areas were 41,124. That is 45% of the total area. So there is a decline of 22,439 square kilometer ice area extent melt from 1992 to 2016. So let's see what are the implications of the Arctic sea ice in declining. The reduction of Arctic sea caused global warming will not only lead to sea level rises and affect the biodiversity, but also complex effect on the Earth's ecosystem. So what are the implications we see on the atmosphere? So on atmosphere, we can see a rise in a form of abnormal weather. The change is more dramatically in summers and autumn. Ice extinct period has become remarkably shorter over the region. So the most intense warming is occurring in the Arctic and its surface based as declining ice sea cover. The annual mean and air temperatures are also increased over almost coastal areas. The mid-latitude regions have experienced cold snow rich in winters, which is why we experience increased abnormal weather in the mid-latitude areas. Like in 2016, in North Europe has the March in 50 years and high rainfall intensity over Europe, Mediterranean and Eastern Asia. So let's see what are implications on the ocean. So Arctic Ocean plays two major roles in global oceanic circulation. It provides an oceanic pathway between the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, and it also takes an Arctic input, modifies it, and returns to the Atlantic. So sea ice retreating, increasing the solar radiation, and also the wind exposure leads to greater ice drift velocities. So on the other hand, we see the increasing light will increase the primary production in the area previously sheltered by the perennial ice cover. So what corresponding with this is increase in new and harvested production of the required and attempt to supply the nutrients. So observation has shown a long-term positive trend of annual mean Arctic average sea ice drift resulting primarily from sea ice thinning. The affecting the sea and direction of the circumpolar boundary current. It is the ocean current that flows clockwise from the west to east and called western wind currents. So by this, the reduction in the nutrient also affect the food chain and then shift of phytoplankton cell size to the smaller mycoplankton and the nanoplankton as well. Such drift is favor the slow energy system and the jellyfish bloom of the region and the high energy food web characterized by fish and marine lifestyle. So what are the effects we see on the terrestrial implication? So affecting the sea, the correlation between mean annual age near the surface permafrost and mean during the half latest latitude at the end of meteorological station in Siberia will tip of positive significance. These spatial pattern in the temporal variation in the permafrost temperatures are consistent and decline in the sea ice extent in the toe, so causing not only has been considered, so also effect on the tundra vegetation and the vertebrate of the fauna as well. So we can see the release of CO2 and methane from the melting of the frozen ice and releasing halogen chemicals on the surface, and then it enters into the food chain, affecting the atmospheric chemical reaction. So we can also see that another aspect look into the marine nutrient flow cycle, marine primary productivity. Climate change driven in primary production, we have consequences of biogeochemical cycling, the success of top predators, and the yield of harvestable resources in Arctic Ocean. Difference indices of the marine food web productivity ranging from zooplankton biomasses, the reduction in nutrient has an effect by shift in phytoplankton cells, favor the smaller pacoplankton and the nanoplankton as well. So yeah, these are the most visible impact on the terrestrial implication. Let's see about what are the legal implications we see. So what are the consequences of sea level rise? Here I would like to give you a brief introduction on the implication of ice melting to the international law, especially to the law of sea. So sea level rise is one of the most severe impact on the climate change, as with rising waters threatening to inundate small islands and nations and coastal region. Based on IPCC report and special report on ocean and cryosphere in changing climate, it is used to take a look at the current understanding of how sea level has changed in the past and may change in the future. So let's see what's the law of the sea. So it's a body of customs and treaties or international agreements by which agreements maintain order, productivity, and peaceful relations on the sea. The consequence of sea level rise prompt a number of important questions, like implication of inundation of the low-lying coastal areas, the islands upon which the baseline is there, the maritime zones extending from the baseline upon the delimiting of the maritime zones. So what are the effects upon the rights of the state with respect to the maritime zone, consequence of the statehood under the law? So also we can see the development we are anticipating during the establishment of these fundamental legal framework to govern the ocean. Consequently, they are posing unprecedented challenge for the sea and global as well regional local. Significance occurs surrounding availability of the law and deal with the threat of disappearing islands. Effect are the basis of impact and the marine environment, including the fisheries. So these are the few examples where we can see the impact is really going on. So we can see the possible legal effect on the baseline, particularly the International Law Association on International Law and Sea Level Rise was formed in order to study these issues to develop proposal for progressive development of international laws in response. Two options for this grave issues that we should consider is to freeze and maintain the baseline as they are, which would mean that internal water, land water, or the terrestrial sea baseline would expand with the sea level rise. And second is to freeze the outer limit to the either to the extent of territorial sea or to the exclusive economic zone. So this is the limitation of the line, and the baseline is a line distinguishing internal waters from the territorial sea. So possible effect is like island plays a very important role in rise of islands as far as the role of construction baseline, and the maritime limitation is also part of it. So while concluding, I would like to say that the major impact causing the ice water is the burning state along with the global warming. Arctic sea ice has complicated the influence on the Earth system. So we have taken the Nobel Zemulai that has a potential lead to radioactivity release as well as causing the changes in the fall and fauna. Should consider the coastal areas or the entire islands area to be covered in international laws. This is a matter of discussion, and we'll be working further on this paper. And overall, we want that every humanity working in this sector and every nation should have the impact and should come forward to discuss such grave issue in this present era. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sakshi, for your report. Does anyone have any questions in regards to the presentation? All the panelists as well can ask their questions, and the audience too. So any questions? No? Okay. Oh, we have a question for Anna. Anna, if you look into question and answers box, you will see it and you can answer it if you like. All right, maybe someone will come up with a question during the next presentations. Again, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. And again, we can discuss it later at the post-panel discussion if there is one, since there's a lot of presentations to follow up. So probably someone will come up with a question. And if there are no more questions at this point, we can move on to the next report, which will be presented by Anton Komarov, who today presents two reports on behalf of his colleague at the Lomonosov State University and his own, but the research is linked as far as I understand, right? So yeah, so since they come from the same field and it's a common project, Anton will talk about snow cover studies at Lomonosov Moscow State University and next variability of the snow cover due to local factors. Anton, go ahead.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Today I have almost 40 minutes to talk. I think it will be shorter, but I'm going to present two different studies. Yes, they are linked, and they are both they are focused on snow cover research. My name is Anton Komarov, and the first part of research was performed with a group of my colleagues from Moscow State University. I'll start with some general information on the snow cover and why it is important to study snow and how it could be used. So ice and seasonal snow cover, it covers approximately 30% of the total land surface area of the planet. So it's a huge territory, and it's essentially important for Arctic and taiga ecosystems because the effect of snow cover on the global ecosystem is huge. Snow controls the function of ecosystems through energy and water balance, and it also affects permafrost, soil and vegetation, and also humans. Why it happens is because snow has a very specific properties, such physical properties as very high albedo, strong insulation properties, and very specific density and microstructure, and also layering. So snow may vary strongly depending on climate, weather conditions, and a variety of local factors. As Alexei Maslakov mentioned in the previous section, the environmental changes in Arctic due to temperature rise are huge, and there are many hazardous processes such as permafrost and erosion and other dangerous aspects. And this is not only temperature growth in Arctic, which affect all this environmental system, but it also the amount of precipitation and also the snow, the specific properties of snow cover and its specific distribution, because deeper snow will provide warmer temperatures on the ground level. So this is why it is important to study these properties and to understand how they are produced through the winter, and which processes are responsible for that. So on this slide, I tried to explain why the scale of measurements is important. So as I mentioned, the effect of snow cover on ecosystems is very complex and may be considered at different scales from local to global. And the global climate models and satellite snow measurements actually have a very low resolution usually. Or the global climate models, it's usually 100 kilometers or sometimes less. And the resolution of satellite snow measurements is also quite small. And what is important here is that all those models and measurements require in situ or field point measurements to calibrate them. And the local as well, however, the local variability of snow cover at the scales of first meters and hundreds of meters or smaller than model pixel is very strong and have to be considered in those models. It depends on both large-scale climate conditions and local factors, as I mentioned, such as vegetation relief and soil properties. And thus, the point measurements rarely could be representative of large territories or territories covered by a single pixel in such models. So the first part of our research was conducted for the last 5 or 6 years, and it was based in Moscow, the Moscow State University Meteorological Observatory. So we performed ground measurements of snow depths, thickness of individual layers, their density, shape, and size of crystals. All this usually performed in 20-meter trenches with half a meter or meter intervals for the last several years. And on this picture, you can see how it looks like. So it's a very flat site with uniform microtopography and uniform grass vegetation. So we can expect that the variability of snow cover will be pretty small. But in the next several slides, I'll show you that it's not really so, because there are many different factors and processes which affect snow through the winter. And what we have is something like these schemes. So these schemes are built based on depth and density data. And then we calculated the snow water equivalent and build those schemes of spatial variability of measured characteristics. Here you can see the variability of snow density within 20-meter profiles on February 2017 and April 2017. As you can see, the variability of individual layers is very strong, and it is actually even stronger than the variability of bulk values calculated from each meter measurements, because the density measurements were measured from each layer, and then we computed the bulk values. So as you can see on the top picture, there is a green the green area below this ice crust, and then we have the blue settled fresh snow. And the variability of the red area is the result mostly of water percolation through the snow because there was a warming and winter thaw, so we have such fluxes. And as for the other picture, it's already after the beginning of snow melt, and we have a very complex picture here, and it's also the result of water percolation. So yeah, we have measured 20-meter trenches each month. So we made 3 to 4 measurements each winter. We also performed peat measurements approximately each 2 weeks. And each month we also measured, before making density measurements, we have measured the snow hardness. And to do that, we have used the innovative tool. It's called the Snow Micropen, and it's a very high resolution snow penetrometer. It has a resolution of about 4 micrometers. And what it really does is it measures the connections, the strengths of the connections or bonds between individual crystals. And we have such kind of signal, as you can see on the picture below. So, but there is a problem with these signals because we can't really derive information we really want from these profiles, because it's not that simple to derive density and snow water equivalent from this hardness signal, and it is still a problem. So there are some attempts in the world literature to do that, but they're not successful yet. So they have only 60 or 70% error. So, and this is how the Snow Micropen looks like. It has a small pin, and this is actually the most important part of all this tool, because it has a very high resolution. Yeah. So based on these schemes, you can see here that we build such schemes from each peat measurement and from each 20-meter trench measurements, and we studied separately each layer. And then using this data, we have calculated the schemes of snow evolution through the winter. So it was a combination of meteorological data from observatory, automatic ultrasonic sensor measurements, which were made with 15 minutes resolution, and peat measurements. So as you can see on this slide, there are 4 different winters, and despite of the length of winter was approximately the same, the combination of winter process were different, and it led to different stratigraphy. So what was common here? Snowpack, it was composed mostly of soft, fresh, settled snow until the middle of winter usually, or until the end of winter in case of very cold and snowy winter 2017-2018. But as you can see, the stratigraphy is different, and this means that the impact of snow cover also should be different, because different stratigraphy means different physical properties of snow, such as insulation properties, which is important for soil and permafrost process. Yeah, so let's move. Another part of this research was the remote sensing methods. We used the standard drone DJI Phantom 4 and the laser scanner Lake Nova to measure the snow depths over the small area. We have used the drone to build the digital model of the absolute heights of the underlying surface. Then we have calculated from photogrammetric methods digital model of absolute height of snow cover. And then we have calculated the differences between those surfaces to calculate the snow height over the area. But there are some problems with this method because it has an error of about 20%, I think, or 10%. And the problem is that the snow usually has a very uniform texture. It's very bright and white, and it makes photogrammetric processing difficult or impossible. But it also depends on the conditions of snow or of snow surface. Another problem is the temperatures, because when it's colder than 15 or 20 degrees Celsius, the battery has a very low capacity. So you have usually only 4 or 5 minutes to make all these procedures. And this is how it looks like. This is the images from different dates of the same winter made from the drone. And these images were used to build those composite photos to apply the photogrammetric methods. So this is how the process looks like. So the photogrammetric processing makes it possible to construct so-called dense cloud of points from image. And the same happens when we use the laser scanning data. So the principles are the same. And here is the result. The first result, the density. We use the flight parameters of the drone, and it was about 30 meters above ground, the flight height, and we acquired an average 1,000 to 2,000 points per square meter. So the resolution was pretty high. But on some dates, as you can see here, for example, February 15 or February 6, we have some gaps. This is because in these areas, the surface, as I already mentioned, was too uniform to find any connections between images. So it made sometimes the photogrammetric processing difficult. But on other dates, it was almost perfect. So, and this is the final result. The snow depth was calculated. And as you can see, it was totally successful. Only 3 days of 5 attempts. So, and this is a result of the laser scanning on the same dates. So, as you can see, there are also some problems, some gaps here. And then we used those results of remote sensing measurements, and they were accompanied by ground-based snow measurements made along 20-meter profiles. And then we compared the results to estimate the errors of each method, and we found that the mean squared error of both LIDAR and photogrammetric methods was about 6 centimeters. And the maximum error was 15 centimeters. And it is quite a big error, about 10% for shallow snowpack, for such snowpack, which is typical for Moscow area. But in areas where the snow depth is much higher, for example, 2 meters or 3, this error surely would be smaller. It would be only 30%. So we can say that this method is very useful and it could be used successfully, but it requires some time to prepare. For example, it requires the high resolution differential GPS stations to acquire such a good resolution. So what was the result of this measurement? So we found that snow cover automatic photogrammetric processing is possible, and that the result depends on the conditions of the snow cover and the lighting conditions. For example, old snow is optimal for work, while fresh, bright snow is difficult to process the data. and the accuracy of snow depth measurements at small areas was about 6 centimeters. Yeah, so this is the end of the first part of my presentation. And now let's move forward, and I'll open another one. It has a related issue. 1 second. Okay. So another part of my research was performed last winter in Alaska Fairbanks, where I studied snow cover under under the mentoring of Professor Matthew Sturm. It was a part of Fulbright Program. Yeah, I already showed you these slides on the general information of snow cover, so I'm gonna skip it. And I'll repeat that it is important because of the resolution of global climate models and satellite snow measurements. So this part of study was performed in Alaska, in central Alaska, near Fairbanks. And the aim of the study was to understand and quantify the effect of local vegetation and microrelief on the snow properties and stratigraphy at the scale of Earth meters. As I already mentioned in the last presentation, the variability could be quite strong even within a very uniform area. But what happens when we add vegetation and some more steep microtopography is that the snow cover becomes more and more variable. And it is also important to understand how it works, because different local factors may have a different effect, at least in case of stratigraphy. And for example, under big conifer trees, tree whales forms, and in steep microtopography, deeper snow may accumulate due to snow creep and settlement of snow during the winter. So yeah, as I mentioned, this study was a part of the Fulbright Visiting Student Research Program and was performed during the winter 2019-2020, just before the quarantine. So the winter, as you probably know, in Alaska is very cold usually. So it was windless with prevailing anticyclonic patterns, and the maximum snow depth was about 80 centimeters this winter, which is a little bit more than average, but slightly above normal. Because the weather was the same at all the 3 sites we have selected in autumn, the snow stratigraphy was pretty similar. Due to kinetic growth metamorphism, by midwinter, the snow cover was mostly composed of extreme depth hoar and facet crystals, while the number of crusts and melt layers was very small due to limited number of winter thaws. And however, the local vegetation had a strong effect on snow structure and properties. Snow depths in spruce and birch forest was 10 and 20% smaller than in the fields, open field area, respectively. And what is also important is that the variability of snow properties in conifer forests was about 30% versus 10% in deciduous forest and 5% in the field. So here are the 3 sites. We have selected the 3 sites with distinctly different vegetation and microrelief. It was a spruce conifer forest. I think it's on the right. A birch deciduous forest at the center, and an open field area with tussocks, grass tussocks. And during the winter, we have measured snow depths, density, and snow water equivalent, same as in Moscow, as well as air temperatures and ground temperatures and wind speed. The measurements were made at 5 to 8 meter penseconds at least 5 times during the winter, and with some additional measurements in pits. So, and here what we found there. At the field site, the snow was the deepest and the snow water equivalent was the biggest. The spatial variability of snow properties was small and did not exceed 5%. Also, the windless conditions prevailed, soft but inhomogeneous wind slabs formed there, despite of the forest sites. And the grass tussocks produced hummocky microrelief and influenced the snow distribution and metamorphism. Deeper and denser snow accumulated between tussocks, and deeper depth hoar layers and thicker wind slab layers formed between tussocks. Actually, above the largest tussocks, no wind slab layers formed. They all formed between tussocks mostly. As for the other side, spruce forests, the effect of spruce trees was the strongest. It resulted in 20% less snow depths and 30% less snow water equivalent at this site compared to the field area. The average snow depth and snow water equivalent beneath tree crowns was more than 2 times smaller than at the open sites. And this means that the ground temperature will also be much colder under trees than at open areas where the snow depth was bigger. And because dense canopies intercepted snow in windless conditions, the distinct tree wells formed. The snow properties in tree wells were also quite variable, because snow unloaded from the canopy and formed a ring of denser snow around the edge of the canopy. And it also had a distinct effect on the further snow metamorphism. Also, the system of voids and cavities formed under and around buried underground understory vegetation, such as small shrubs and small conifers. And it also affected the rates of kinetic growth metamorphism, and it resulted in pretty different stratigraphy. So it is always a combination of different processes and differences in vegetation and topography, which produce the resulting snow stratigraphy. And the other side, the left side, the birch forest, the deciduous forest, no tree wells formed, but the snow depth was about 10% less compared to open areas. It was mostly the effect of snow interception, which was, however, limited but measurable. Snow also unloaded from trees and disturbed snow stratigraphy sporadically and in a random manner. Deeper snow accumulated in permafrost meltout troughs, even in relatively windless conditions, mostly due to creep and snow settling into the depressions during the winter. Snow kinetic growth metamorphism near tree trunks, logs, and in meltouts was diminished. So what is important here is that snow, as you can see, is really variable. And even if different processes produce very similar outcomes in terms of density and snow water equivalent, the stratigraphy might be very different. And actually, the stratigraphy is very important because it is the result and the consequence of the previous winter conditions, weather winter conditions. And by studying snow stratigraphy, we can try to understand what happened during the last 3 or 4 months. Yeah. So to conclude, I would like to say that the effect of landscape smoothing was observed at all the 3 sites. Deeper snow accumulated on convex forms of relief in windless conditions, while the effect of smoothing was stronger in windy conditions. Additionally to tree vegetation and microtopography, short understory vegetation, logs, and other objects at the surface altered the snow properties at the scales of centimeters to first meters. And while the effect of each of these factors separately was small, the cumulative might be big enough, and it requires more detailed studies. It's also important to mention that the results of the study are only representative for very similar climates like Alaska, but in windy Arctic environments and in warm Moscow region environments, the snow vegetation interactions would be pretty different and result in different process in different snow properties. But the whole idea is the same. The scale and temporal resolution of snow measurements matters. Local scale snow cover variability should be studied in order to understand the function of ecosystems at local to global scales. Thank you very much for your attention. Hope you have some questions. If you have, feel free to ask me, and I'll try to fulfill your requirements or interests. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anton, for your presentations. Thank you to your colleagues as well. If any panelist has a question for Anton.
Hey, Anton, it's Nick.
Yeah, hi, Nick.
Hey.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to see you, yes. I have two questions. The first question is was there an optimal lighting season for that amazing photometry of the scanning? Like, you know, was the fall or the spring? Was there an ideal lighting condition that you found?
Okay, so the best light conditions is when it's a little bit cloudy, but at the same time when the snow is old. So when the surface is rough enough to have some distinct micro surface, micro topography. So this is important for photogrammetric methods, because when it's very flat and white and when the snow is fresh, it reflects the signal everywhere except when it have to go. So yeah, the best conditions is old, I think, spring snow with some distinct micro topography on the surface. Yeah, but there is also another aspect. I didn't mention it, but another problem is that when we measured and when we constructed the digital elevation model of the surface, of the underlying surface, there still was some grass there. The height of the grass was about 5 or 3 centimeters. But when it snows and after it's 10 or 15 centimeters of snow, it's already settled under the snow, under the weight of snow. So there is probably another error of 2 or 3 centimeters due to grass vegetation. So.
Yeah, that's really neat, because it'd be interesting to see this method over Bergeracs, over large microtopography. And so you're saying in March, after the end of the season, is kind of the optimal time.
Yeah. In Alaska, for example, I think it's usually too bright and the snow is fresh. In Moscow region, we have many winter salts, so the conditions are usually better. But the other problem is in mountains, for example, the weather conditions might be quite severe, and in Arctic. So it will be probably difficult.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'll send you an email about it, because that's definitely something we want to consider. That leads to my second question is, obviously one of the leading hot topics right now is the fact that shrub growth is actually insulating the permafrost in the winter, causing deeper thaw, right? So the Arctic greening hypothesis is actually, for a decade, people thought the shrub growth would reduce the permafrost sink, but it's actually increased it. What's interesting to consider is that maybe there's some optimal height where eventually, when the shrubs or forests get large enough, say in 30 years, then it goes back to actually, protecting the permafrost. But
okay, I'll try to comment this from my point of view. There is another aspect, because in windy environments, deeper snow, as you know, accumulates in shrubs. So if the shrubs expand to the north, larger territories will have deeper snow. And deeper snow is a good insulator. So it makes the soil warmer, and it could lead to further permafrost melt. So I think this is one of the reasons.
That's what the Department of Energy found, right? After this 10-year, NGE study, is they're finding just how important the shrub growth is to, deeper snowpack. And so, Yeah, keep up the good work. I really liked your figures, the stratigraphy of snow at your 7 sites. I've never seen anybody do that, so that's really nice.
Yeah, it was inspired by Matthew.
Okay, that makes sense. The legend himself.
And actually, he has several articles on the shrubs expansion, so you could read them. Pretty interesting, with also cool figures and stuff. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. We have one more question, I think. Yeah, there's also one for Sakshi, but she left. So the question for Anton, have you conducted this research? Well, it was probably during your first presentation. Have you conducted this research only in Moscow or in other areas as well? We now know Alaska, but maybe some others. And other comparative snow cover studies on a larger scale? That's the question.
Okay.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe between countries or what the attendee meant.
Yeah, okay. I'll try to answer these questions. So as for the photogrammetry and LIDAR, we only made measurements in Moscow. Yeah, but we also tried to use the drone in other areas. And as I already mentioned, there are some problems with severe weather conditions in mountains and in Arctic, but it's still possible. And as for the other question about the other, one second, about the other areas and the larger scale of studies. In Alaska, we only measured the snow, the scales of, the distance between sites was about, I think, 100 or 200 meters only. So the scale was not very large. But here in Moscow, we made some additional measurements around Moscow, not only in Moscow State University, but I also make regular measurements near Sergei Posad, 60 kilometers to the northeast. And the snow stratigraphy is quite the same, but quite different. There are some differences due to warmer weather, due to warmer air temperature in Moscow. The difference is not huge, but when the temperature is about 0, the difference might be quite huge. For example, during the spring snowmelt, the snow melt is much more intensive sometimes in Moscow than here in Moscow region. So yeah, but this is, I think, the largest scales of our research we conducted. So, but yes, we try to, here we work within the single climate class, so the Moscow region. But of course, we compared the snow, the Moscow snow stratigraphy with snow stratigraphy in Alaska and with stratigraphy in Hibina Mountains. So this kind of work was also done. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions from the panel or audience? Probably not. Okay, then thank you so much once again, Anton, for your extensive report. And we are, thank you so much. And we move on to the next report, titled Basics of the Standardized Methodology for Monitoring of Cryogenic Processes in the Arctic Regions of Russia, presented by Vasily Talmanov, also from Lomonosov Moscow State University. Welcome, Vasily.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. We're jumping back to the permafrost topic. All right. Just one sec. All right, can you see my screen? Can you see it, right?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Vasily. I just graduated from the Department of Cryolithology and Glaciology from Moscow State in Geographical Faculty, and my master's work was about basics of the standardized methodology for monitoring of cryogenic processes in the Arctic regions of Russia. All we know who study permafrost that cryogenic processes are, first of all, the main threat to the existing infrastructure, and really bright indicator of the permafrost state in changing natural systems. And there are two huge international programs for the permafrost monitoring. First is Thermal State of Permafrost, which is supported by NSF and Calm Circumpolar Active Layer Monitoring Program. I participate in Calm more actively, but I was in 2018, I was at AGU conference, and I just realized that there are really a lot of monitoring works about cryogenic processes, but there is still no unified program for the cryogenic process monitoring yet. That's why I just wanted to, I don't know, to understand, is it possible theoretically to organize such a program? I know that it's quite expensive and financially it requires a lot of money, but my goal was just to estimate the theoretical possibility of creating a network. So what I did in during my research, I analyzed the effectivity of existing permafrost monitoring programs. I just considered classifications of cryogenic processes and select parameters for its mode designation. It's also a term that I developed a scheme, and so how we can create it for each process. Also how we can apply quantitative modern methods for forecasting and for monitoring, and to afterwards to create some experimental sites for monitoring to do such a project. So yeah, this is the organizational scheme of processes observation. So the first, we need to choose the cryogenic process. The second, we need to choose the model region, the region where the process manifestation will be maximal for it. So we can just interpolate it for the other regions where it will be less active, to select the optimal monitoring procedure based on the archival materials and based on publication and last experience, and to prepare the site of the project. So we chose processes based on denudation or process rates. For example, we just find out the cryogenic creep because it's super slow processing. We cannot effectively monitor it in the fields. Use of remote sensing methods, for example, thermal abrasion, people monitor it from the using remote sensing materials, and they do it successfully. Or methods that already exist, like thermal abrasion. Also, people do it effectively, or this process included in a complex of other works like Calm. Like in Calm program, people measure those substance and seasonal heaving. So we stopped on 5 processes: thermal erosion, thermokarst, solar fluxion, frost heaving, Bingo's appearance, and thermal contraction cracking. So I analyzed meteorological data and boreholes data analysis, studied a lot of literature and archival materials. And first of all, yeah, cracking. What is cracking? Cracking is caused by a sharp decrease in ground temperatures in the surface layers due to daily or longer cooling that occur without of snow, less than 40 centimeters. And it should be a daily temperature decrease more than 15 degrees, less than 0 degrees. So for example, like from minus 15 to minus 30, and it should be continuous permafrost. So what I did, I just used meteorological data from Obninsk, from World Data Bank, and I just analyzed these temperatures for 18 years, from 2000 to 2018, the latest possible dates, and applied snow height less than 40 centimeters and applied filter continuous permafrost. So I just wrote a code on Python, and we can see that cracking is more active in the continental regions such as Zabaikali region and Magadan Oblast and Yakutia also, which also proves the hypothesis of Nikolai Nikitich Romanovsky, who stated that it depends on continentality of climate. And afterwards, after this, we applied another filters. So we just tried to find, using the satellite data, we tried to find proofs in the relief, I mean, modern cracks. And also we analyzed the vegetation zone because definitely it cannot develop in the in taiga zone because roots are roots play an important role, and it will be better crack in tundra. So we found 10 points for the cracking monitoring. That's how it was. And afterwards, using the experience of G. Ross McKay, who did a fantastic work in Canada and used the modern experience of UNIS, I just created a monitoring site project for this process with a series of boreholes, with the thermal profile, with a time-lapse camera for the snow monitoring, with the automatic meteorological station and a bunch of soil temperature loggers, and the most important, pressure registrators and crack meters, like it was in original Mackay's work. For thermokarst, I just analyzed the meteorological data, and for two regions, for West Siberia, for Tambay and for Chersky, where thermokarst is actively developing, I just did a modeling. So I just used different climatic scenarios from IPCC, and I modeled the temperature of permafrost and active layer thickness. So I just modeled it to 2015, and it was the ice body on 2 meters. So I just created a model in QFrost, that's the permafrost modeling software, and I applied that there is an ice body on 2 meters. And will it be activated if we will apply different climatic scenarios? And we can see that temperature on 10 meters, temperature on the zero amplitudes, it changes, but active layer thickness, it increases, but just for 50%. So if the ice body will lay on 2 meters, the thermokarst will not occur there, even if we apply RCP 8.5. So the worst scenario. That means that thermokarst depends more on the local factors such as, local hydrology of the surface or local snow redistribution, like Anton just said. And also we prepared a project of monitoring site for observation. So we just created a count site here and combined it with the thermal profile and with some bathymetric works. And I think that the complexity, the complex approach will be better for each cryogenic process, and of course for thermokarst. For thermal erosion, I just created a map of areas optimal for monitoring in Western Siberia. It should be in Arctic and Northern Tundra. This was my bachelor research about thermal erosion. So it should be in tundra with the high ice content and with high level of soil wash. So it's typical for Yamal and for Gedan Peninsula. And the new thing that I applied from Konstantin Voskresensky, it was his idea, he was a geomorphologist, that gully's density, where we have already developed gully network or erosion network, the water will just flow using the existing network. So it will not activate it in the next 30 or 50 years. But if we have no developed network, but we have all factors that gives thermal erosion opportunity to, I don't know, to develop, here this process in the terms of climate change can activate very fast and rapidly. So the pink color, this is these zones for where it can be activated in the next 50 years, and it means that we should monitor it here. And also we did a monitoring sites for thermal erosion, but I can share the link for my whole work, but we do not have time to discuss it here. And for soil fluxion, I just applied filter that it should be tundric zone with the fine deposits and with the highly moisture reductive layer. And so what we understood that this should be areas of mountain and plain tundra with cold mountain and Arctic desert conditions, and it cannot develop in the taiga zone, as we know. So we can base it on the already existing calm sites. Our analysis showed that 15 to 20% of the sites lay in suitable conditions for monitoring. Yeah, and this is also soil fluxion monitoring site based on Voskresensky works. Another scientist I can share it also. So this is a slow process, so we can just create such a lot of time-lapse cameras and drilled poles and temperature and moisture loggers, and do drone or photogrammetry shooting, and it will be okay for monitoring. So we're going to conclusions. I know that all people are tired already, and I think I highlighted it during the research, but yeah, I will just one more time will repeat that in modern conditions, so all this process can be monitored in the paragenetic complex. So it can be monitored together, and only this complex approach can give us an opportunity to understand the life of the permafrost system, even in the, I don't know, in the one point, and afterwards we can understand its modern state. Thank you very much. I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vasily, for such a thorough research and presentation. Anyone from the panel has questions for Vasily or from the audience? If not, I have a question. So what needs to be done for this uniform method to be implemented further and take its place among the preferred methods, different programs that you mentioned?
I mentioned that different kind of permafrost researchers, they monitor processes using their own approach. I would say that using for example, one guy, he is a cryostratigrapher, and he monitor thermokarst processes using his cryostratigraphical approach as heavy people from Alfred Wegener do, and all that we can do for now. I think I'll do this in the near future, just to create just one site in the region where we can apply, where it's applicable for all kinds of process, and we can find these points on the map. For example, it's the Yamal Peninsula or the northeastern territories near the Lena Delta, and we can per genetic complex. It means, for example, Ruskaya Ustye. This is the village just 4 hours from Chokordakh in Yakutia. There are bright paragenetic complex right there. So it is a cracking processes actively developed, thermokarst processes actively developed, and the reappearance of permafrost also here, thermal erosion. So we can monitor it, we can start monitoring even at the one point there, and then try to, I don't know, to do such a network. But the thing that that should be done at first, we need to create this just one site. And I think my PhD work or future work, who knows, will dedicate it to this kind of research. So with the action to the field work, because application of the remote sensing methods, it's just it's just allow people to work from home, and it's more, it is cheaper.
And do you expect any interest in that from the field, like from your colleagues? And
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. But I think I just need to start or to create the first site and to take part with the results in the conferences, and probably people will want to join me, because I know that each scientist has its own program, and sometimes it's difficult to like ask them, hey, join me please, or
you can ask right now.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, if anyone wants to join Vasily, we will feature, as I've already mentioned, right, in some of my guidelines, we will do a narrative report about the event and make it public, so anyone who wants to get in touch with the panelists will have an opportunity to do so. So hopefully your research will be furthered by participating in this seminar.
Hopefully. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Vasily, once again. And if there are no more questions about Vasily's report, we move on to the next one, titled Snow Avalanches and Their Impact on the Infrastructure in the Arctic Zone of Russia, by Alla Turchaninova, also from Lomonosov Moscow State University. Alla, go ahead.
Dear colleagues, good evening, or maybe good morning, I don't know.
Good night.
Good morning, good night. Yeah, good day. My name is Alla Turchaninova, and I'm the research associate from the Lomonosov Moscow State University. I'm working at the Faculty of Geography, research laboratory of snow avalanches and debris flows, and at the same time at the Department of Cryolithology and Glaciology. And I'm investigating avalanches dynamics, as well as problems related to the avalanche hazard assessment and mitigation strategies against avalanches. So I would like to start from the point that avalanches are fascinating, aren't they? What do you think? They are really beautiful, but at the same time, they are extremely dangerous, and they can cause a lot of problems in the mountain regions, and a lot of efforts are made to protect people against avalanches in mountain regions, and they need a lot of investments, and that is the problem. And you can see the example of the avalanche protection in the Swiss Alps on the right side of my slide. And this is really an interesting case. So I would like to start about the avalanche problems in Russia. Avalanche-hazard regions in Russia occupy 18% of its territory. So that's really a lot. And more than 6 million people live in the avalanche-hazard regions in Russia, and as well as potential avalanche hazard regions where avalanches can start to form due to the climate change or due to the deforestation, because forests can protect people from avalanches. Avalanche hazard assessment in our country right now is based on the simplest one-dimensional Russian avalanche dynamics and statistical models. And this is a case because they are not so state of the art. I mean that they are one-dimensional, and when we are talking about mountains, it's very important to take into account, for example, the three-dimensional terrain, yes, and of course it's very hard to model avalanches in one dimension. Avalanche hazard assessment right now is based on the prediction of the extreme avalanches without their reference to their return period. And this could be also a problem because sometimes avalanches, very big and destructive avalanches, they can be formed, I don't know, one time in 1,000 years. And therefore, for example, it's not making sense to put great investments in the protection against them if they happen so not so frequently. Yes, and the calculations in our country right now are performed most of the time manually without special software. And this can be also a problem because if we are talking about the land use planning and the avalanche assessment, avalanche hazard assessment of large territories, at the same time, that could cause problems. So let's move to the Arctic region, Arctic zone of Russia. The total avalanche hazard area in Russia exceeds 850,000 square kilometers, and therefore future economic development of new mountain territories in the Arctic zone of Russia require understanding at least of the avalanche hazard problem and potential risk. Right now, the regions that we know that are endangered by snow avalanches include France, Joseph Land, Novaya Zemlya, Severная Zemlya, and Franklin Island. At the same time, we don't really exactly know because they are not other territories and other islands in small islands. They are not populated, and therefore we are not so really interested in avalanche problems there. But at the same, they could also be avalanche hazards. If we are talking about the continent, avalanches regularly occur at mountains at Kola Peninsula, Polar Urals, the Baranga Mountains, the Putarana Plateau, mountain areas of Yakutia, and the Magadan region and Chukotka. Every year, numerous avalanches of different types, for example, wet or dry, slab or powder, and volumes, small, very small, and very big, occur in mountain regions in the Arctic zone of Russia. And avalanche fatalities, unfortunately, regularly take place in the Khibiny Mountains. They were registered at in Monchi Tundra, Lavazor Tundras, in Murmansk, in the Polar Ural, and in the Putarana Plateau and Chukotka. The destruction of infrastructure in the Arctic, in the Russian Arctic by snow avalanches are reported in Kirovsk, Talnakh, in the villages of Ekvigenot, Providenie, and Berengovsky in Chukotka. But by the way, the Arctic regions, they have their special main features of snow avalanche formation. For example, small relative height of avalanche tracks, in comparison to Alps or some other Himalayas, relatively low precipitation, but very intense blizzards at the same time, very low air temperatures, and therefore very low avalanche hazard period duration. And right now, introduction exactly to my research, the legislation on the land use planning in Russian Federation requires the natural hazards and their characteristics to be accounted for and available in the form of maps. Snow avalanches right now are the most significant natural hazards in the mountains, in the Khibiny Mountains, in the Kirovsk town. And in this research, the importance of the avalanche hazard zoning implementation into Russian practice is discussed on the example of Kirovsk town located in the Khibiny Mountains. I just would like to mention that despite the existence of the large-scale avalanche mapping approaches in Russia, as well as risk assessment experience accumulated so far, right now, large-scale maps in Russia, they are not so popular, and of course, they are made, but avalanche hazard zoning approaches that are worldwide used, for example, in the Alps, they are not implemented into the Russian avalanche hazard assessment and land use planning. And here on the slide, we can see two examples of the town development plans in Russia. One of them is for the Kirovsk, and they are not clear. And they are not enough for the land use planning authorities to decide whether this territory is avalanche hazardous or not. They show only the avalanche release zones most of the time for most of the regions where the avalanches can release. But as usual, not in all the cases, but as usual, they don't show the run-out zones of avalanches where most of the infrastructure is constructed. But in most of the Alpine European countries, the avalanche hazard zoning approach is used, where hazard zoning is made depending on frequency and intensity of avalanches. And this is really a very good approach, because we can separate avalanche hazard territories on zones with different of avalanche hazard, and we can put restrictions to different zones. For example, here you can see an example of the avalanche hazard zoning plan made for Switzerland, Graubünden canton, where avalanche hazard degree depends on frequency or return period of avalanches and intensity, avalanche impact pressures. And we can see here two zones, red zone, where construction of new buildings or reconstruction of old ones is prohibited, and the blue zone with the medium avalanche hazard, where we should where special measures, avalanche protection measures, should be applied. And in this case, it's possible to construct new buildings. And in different countries, these criteria for the definition of hazard zones, they are different. And most of the time, they were based on the historical experience and historical local features of mountain territories use. So right now I would like to show my example. My research was done on the example of Khibiny Mountains located on the Kola Peninsula in the Murmansk region in the north of the European part of Russia. The industrial development of the region was first carried out without avalanche hazard consideration, and therefore the infrastructure was built in the avalanche hazard zones. However, after the big avalanche disaster in the town of Kirovsk in December 1935 climbed 88 lives, the event and the area became a starting point for active avalanche science development in the former Soviet Union. And this region is really an exception among other Arctic mountain regions because of the available, most well-documented, longest avalanche data set in Russia and even in the world from 1930s, collected by the local avalanche warning service. Right now, Kirovsk is a 90-year-old mining. It was incorporated in 1929 to mine the unique apatite nepheline ore from the Hibini deposit. This is one of the world's biggest and richest deposits and the main source of phosphate rock in Russia right now. And at the same time, Kirovsk is a popular ski resort in Russia. And now it's really very popular. And here you can, on the right of my slide, you can see an example of the ski map. And on the left, you can see the same territory, but from the opposite side. And here you can see the mining. And this is one of the Kirovsk town districts that was the case study of our research. On this slide, you can see the approach that we implemented into our research, the method for assessment of avalanche hazard for the infrastructure. So first, the most important step was the analysis of terrain using large-scale topographic maps, historical maps and dams, analysis of climate and snow data, and the most important step was the analysis of historical avalanche records available since 1930s. Analysis of remote sensing data, winter and summer field observations, forest structure and state check, avalanche release zones and average fracture height indication. And another very important step was numerical simulations of snow avalanches using Rams. I will talk a little bit later about this. And as a result, we were able to make an avalanche hazard zoning plan. So here, this slide demonstrates the information about the Avalanche Dynamics Program Rams. This is the two-dimensional model that was developed in Switzerland, and right now it is one of the most regularly used avalanche dynamics model in the world because it gives quite accurate results. Here you can see the main input parameters, so relief, information about avalanche potential or possible release zones, and friction coefficients. So the first and probably one of the most important steps was the calibration of Rams, because this model was developed in Switzerland, and our first goal was to understand whether it's really possible to use it in the Arctic, in the Russian Arctic, or not only in the Russian, because of this very special features of mountain regions. And we tested Rams. We back calculated more than 100 real avalanches, and after modifying the input friction coefficients, we were able to reconstruct most of them. I will not go deeper into the details of this work because that could be another one or two more presentations, but the result was that we calibrated this model, that it was that we understood that we are able to use it in the Arctic with an appropriate accuracy. So here it's our case study place. This is one of the districts of the Kirovsk town, which is called just in the local jargon, 25th kilometer, where the town, the district is situated. Here, several avalanche tracks that you can see their numbers. And this territory, it was already protected. So several avalanche catching dams were constructed here to protect the road and the houses in this region. But in 2016, two artificially triggered dry avalanches unexpectedly crossed two catching dams and reached the houses, the 5-floor houses here located below these avalanche tracks in this district. And we tried to back calculate these avalanches to be able also to incorporate the existing avalanche mitigation structures in the region into our approach of the avalanche hazard assessment. So here you can see the results of the back calculation of these avalanches. So the results were quite accurate because this is only the model, so this is not reality. And therefore, after the calculation of back calculation of other avalanches, we decided, after analysis of the historical records, we decided at this step of our research first to apply the Swiss avalanche hazard zoning approach, where avalanche hazard zoning depends on frequency and intensity or impact pressures of avalanches. This is the region. You can see it on the map, and you can see here pictures or photos of slopes from two different sides, from one side and from the opposite side. One side is the ski resort, and the opposite side is a territory of mining. And on the map, you can also see the avalanche outlines, the real outlines of avalanches. So then we analyzed these real avalanche historical records. We analyzed the terrain using Arctic dam, and we simulated avalanches of different return periods to calculate impact pressures and to reconstruct possible runout distances using Rams. So here you can see the result. At the same time, you can see the picture of one of the houses in the region that the avalanche, for example, reached in 2016. And yes, so what do we have? We have red zone and we have a blue zone. And the red zone where the buildings should not be built according to the Swiss approach, but they were built according to the Russian approach. And we can see the blue zone where should be special restrictions on the avalanche on the construction of new buildings. But as you could see before on the previous slide, the real outlines of real avalanches, they were smaller, but that is due to the applied avalanche mitigation measures in the region. Temporary mitigation measures such as artificial triggering of avalanches and structural such as avalanche catching dams. So this picture is very hazard or dangerous one, because right now a lot of infrastructure is situated in the red zone and in the blue zone. Of course, the local avalanche warning services, they are working and they are putting great efforts to protect local people, the mining and the recreants or tourists. But at the same time, our conclusions are that avalanche protection system reconstruction must be done as soon as possible. And I'm talking more about the structural avalanche protection measures to protect the infrastructure in Kirovsk. The criteria for the determination of the boundaries between the zones with different degree of avalanche hazards, they can be discussed because this is a new region, this is Arctic, and we have to think more precisely about special features of this region. But however, in comparison of avalanche hazard and risk zoning as a component of land use planning in Russian Arctic fulfills the requirements of legislation and helps to increase the safety of people, and this is the most important, and to decrease avalanche risks and consequences of emergency situation. And this is very important. This is just the example, the powder cloud of one of the avalanches that reached this district. And thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to answer your questions.
Thank you, Alla. Thank you so much. We have one question. Just a second. It's in the chat. Is it possible to predict occurrences of avalanches?
Can you repeat one more time?
Is it possible to predict avalanches
To
in
predict
general?
avalanches,
So when,
more or less, yes. But of course,
Mhm.
not all the forecasts, they can be reliable. It depends on many factors. So in case if it's not, then the territory should be closed.
And have there been more avalanches in the past decades? Is there a research on that? Is there a study in the Russian Arctic that would show that avalanches are increasing or not?
Unfortunately, in the Russian Arctic, there were no research like that because the avalanche real data of real observations is only available for Khibiny Mountains. And in the Khibiny Mountains, the amount of avalanches is more or less the same. But in other regions of the world, there were several researches connected to that intensity of avalanche activities, and it depends on the region. And there are fluctuations. So sometimes there are periods with almost no avalanches. For example, in the Caucasus during the last 10 years, there were less avalanches in some regions of the Caucasus. And before there were much more avalanches and they were much more intensive. So, but actually nobody knows really to which factors this is related because it's a very complex question.
Yeah, I see. Any more questions from the panel or audience? No more questions? Okay. If you have questions, again, I repeat, you can drop them in the Q&A box for Alla to answer. And I think we can move on to the next report. Alla, yes, thank you. So we have our next presenters with us because I see, yeah. Okay. Nicholas, you'll go next because we have one more presentation before you, actually. But if we don't, because I just can't see our next presenters turning on their cameras, Katerina and Troy. Okay, Nicholas, you can go on since you're already all set and ready. Yeah, and just a sec, let me introduce you properly. Okay, so the next report is titled The Permafrost Carbon Feedback, Implications for the Paris Accord and Carbon Budget of the 21st Century, presented by Nicholas Hassan from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So go ahead, Nicholas.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Greetings from Fairbanks. And yes, so I'll be discussing the permafrost carbon feedback in the context of the Paris Agreement. And of course, the Paris Agreement is our attempt to wrangle in a climate under 2 degrees by the end of the century. But as I'll discuss, that's very unlikely for several reasons. One being sort of this climate sensitivity index has been upgraded. And the climate sensitivity index is how ecosystems will respond to warming. One of them being this permafrost carbon feedback. And so I'll present some problems that we're facing and then some solutions and sort of looking ahead, but not too far ahead. There's still a lot to solve. We're still in the very early stages of understanding permafrost thaw. It was just in 1994 that Zimov in Yakutia in Russia first proposed the carbon, what he called a carbon bomb, you know, that the permafrost stored so much carbon that if it were to thaw, these would be the results. That wasn't really taken seriously until the late 90s when it was actually verified that the permafrost indeed does store a tremendous, enormous amount of carbon. And follow-up research has only confirmed that each year. And so I'll talk about some of the more recent results and how we're investigating it. And so I'm funded by the National Science Foundation Arctic Observation Network. So we work in Alaska, in Yakutia, in Chersky, Kolyma region. So I'll be over there over the coming years. So I hope to see you all in Chersky. Also I'm funded by NASA, which is using some really cool instruments now to try to solve this problem. So I'll go ahead and give you the update. So first, the problem is that the permafrost soils contain an enormous amount of carbon, as you're mostly aware of. And so just in the top 3 meters is 1,000 gigatons, or about 100 years worth of human emissions, potential emissions, right? So not all of this will be kinetically transformed into the atmosphere, but even if 10% were CO2, that would be 10 years of global emissions, right? That would be trillions of dollars worth of, that would wipe out trillions of dollars of otherwise used oil reserves, right? So there's actually an economics to this, and that's all based on ecology and Earth system science. And so there's more carbon now in the permafrost in just the top 3 meters than all of the biomass, living biomass on Earth combined. So it's hard to even imagine, for example, there's more carbon in the permafrost than 10 Amazons, right? It's hard to even consider the amount of stored energy here. And yet it's frozen, right? It's locked away from our atmosphere, but that's starting to change. And so under the RCP 8.5, which is usually considered the most extreme, we know that 40% of the permafrost will thaw by the end of the century from modeling, right? As Vasily was talking about, these kind of models that can project changes. And the second problem is, if this kinetic energy is transformed into methane, then we have an even worse problem, because methane is 30 times more potent than CO2, and methane has been dramatically rising, tripled since pre-industrial times in 1750, 1800. So just in the last 20 years, 10% of the methane budget has increased, and approximately 25% of all the warming in our atmosphere has been from methane, but you'll notice it's in parts per billion, right? So it's a very small amount, but it has a huge thermal punch. And so the causal agent being the CO2 emissions have caused greenhouse gas warming in the sense that thermal energy and infrared is absorbed by CO2. And this is a landmark paper that just came out in October by Schwalm, University of California, showing, look, the historical rate of carbon accumulation and the current rate is the RCP 8.5. That's 8.5 watts per meter squared. It makes absolutely no sense to talk about any other projection than the one we're on, which is the 8.5. And so they recently updated the climate index, showing that it's very likely that we will, at the minimum, be about 2.1 C by the end of the century, but anywhere between 2.1 C and 4.1 C. So it's sort of baked in now, and it's very unlikely to change by 2030. Even under COVID lockdown, we only reduced emissions by 17%. So it's hard to even imagine a deviation from, say, maybe 4.5 to 8.5 is really what everybody's talking about now. The 2.6 scenario is not realistic. And so that implications, it follows from that logic that, okay, probably 40% of the permafrost will thaw, that's incredible to think about. Then the question is, okay, well, how much of that is actually released into the atmosphere? And that's where things become very uncertain. Of course, the evidence is clear. CH4 methane is rising, especially since 2007. But the real clue here is that the isotope of the CH4, the C13, is become isotopically negative globally. So that's a huge clue, and you'll see that big amplitude shift in 2007 there in the middle of your screen. That kind of tells us something has changed. One hypothesis there's about 12 hypotheses right now. One I'm exploring is that the reason the C13, the delta C13 is negative is because permafrost carbon feedbacks have started. And so what evidence is there for that? Well, if we look at the permafrost carbon isotope record, we'll see that all of it is essentially negative, right? So if you kind of take the mean there, it's about minus 65. In contrast, oil and gas is usually, it's not even on this scale, it's down in 25, 20. And so we know that some biogenically, isotopically negative carbon is being added to our atmosphere rapidly. And most likely it's from the tropics, which is what most people consider. The other alternative could be that it's from the permafrost itself, because look, if you see, thermokarst lakes in Siberia, you have a very old Pleistocene carbon deposit. Same here in Alaska. Most of the isotopes I collect are negative 73, 38,000-year-old gas being released. And so it's plausible that the permafrost is starting to emit much more ancient carbon, especially since 2007, as we've seen rapid changes in the Arctic. But again, it's a hypothetical, it's a hypothesis, so it hasn't been validated. But if a permafrost carbon feedback were to begin, it would have a strong negative isotope trend. So that's the important takeaway here, is that one way we can monitor the global atmospheric change of CH4 is to understand the isotopes. And right now there's a lot of efforts to try and use clumped isotope records to differentiate tropics from permafrost in the Arctic. That's kind of the holy grail, is if you can figure out clumped isotope attribution. There's only like 3 labs in the world doing that because it's a very hard laboratory method, but it's very promising. So I think in 10 years, we'll have progressed dramatically here. And so what do we know right now about methane in the atmosphere? Well, we know each year there's about 576 trillion grams. And above 50 degrees north in the Pan-Arctic, what's called the bottom-up estimate, or the in situ field measurements, there's about 60 trillion grams. But with a high uncertainty, you see the range there from 36 to 89. So about maybe the high end of this right now is approximately 10% of the global methane budget could be sourced from permafrost landforms. But more likely, that's just the Arctic budget as a whole. So you can see that methane emissions from the Arctic are not the driving force, right? They're not even in third place right now. And so currently we kind of have this baseline of where methane in the Arctic is contributing, and it's not significant right now. However, top-down modeling estimates are even lower. This is modeling estimates from atmospheric flash networks. They only estimate about 4% of the global methane budget is from this Pan-Arctic region, including the permafrost. So it's somewhere between 4 and 10% of the global budget, which is low. But like I said, creating this baseline is absolutely necessary to establish long-term references for evaluating this hypothesis of the permafrost carbon feedback, because if it was started to accelerate, we would need to know a reference frame to go, well, where did we start from? And this will be useful in the context of developing our carbon strategy. And so why the discrepancies? Why are we not sure? What are the solutions? Well, one solution is what we've been doing. This is the Arctic observation, or I'm sorry, the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment. It's been a 5-year-long study by NASA, and what the approach has been is to take this integration of scale. So from the leaf level, or as Anton was mentioning, the sort of snow depths, specific vegetation, to the actual regional forests, say tundra versus boreal, versus thermokarst versus bijurox versus many different types of features that then can be analyzed at a footprint level with a flux tower and then integrated into a remote sensing or satellite to be modeled. And so you can see this nice scaling approach where you look at the Arctic as a bunch of puzzle pieces, and maybe you shape them by size and color. But unlike the puzzle pieces that you might use at home, these puzzle pieces are changing with time, and their shape and size are changing. So you need to keep monitoring them every 5 years. That makes remote sensing absolutely necessary because it's hard to go out and measure. I go out and measure the same sites for 15 months continuously, and I've covered very little ground. And most researchers maybe visit a few hundred sites in their life, right? And so it's a small fraction. We need remote sensing to scale, but you need to ground truth remote sensing to know what you're actually seeing, what your products are. And as Anton mentioned, the uncertainty, knowing your uncertainty from these remote sensing is absolutely necessary. And more importantly, we need to get below the ground. And that's what I do, is I look at the subsurface with geophysics, and I try to use geophysics and remote sensing and connect them. And so we're using this instrument from Jet Propulsion Lab. You're probably familiar with them because they study methane on Mars, and they have a rover on Mars, but they're also in the Arctic. Because of this study in California, they asked, well, what's the big contribution of methane in California? And so they flew this sort of spacecraft-like instrument over California and found out that just a few hundred sites in California contribute to 1/3 the entire state's methane budget, which was incredible because you can actually change that. You can go in and these are gas leaks from wells. And so then they asked, well, what if we flew this over the Arctic? Maybe we'd find huge emissions that we wouldn't know about, big seeps. And so that's what they did. Chip Miller at GPL wrote this proposal, and they've been flying over the Arctic, and you can see through these continuous, discontinuous, sporadic, those are those puzzle pieces again, trying to understand each ecotype. And what has been found, so I've been working with Clayton Elder, Chip's postdoc, and it's amazing because if you take 1 billion of these micro seeps and you bend them by distance to water, you find a power series law, which is amazing of Arctic methane. And so this is the kind of thing that we can get from remote sensing, is these large patterns that emerge. Because this is a modeling holy grail, right? We can say, well, we'll just create a buffer around lakes and then test that. And that's what we've been doing. So this is a paper we just submitted, is under review, but you can download the preprint right now, where we characterize these hotspots surrounding lakes, thermokarst lakes. And what we find is that even though these hotspots only represent 0.01% of the land area in Alaska, they make up 4 to 8% of the global Pan-Arctic wetland budget. And so it seems that the closer we look at these extreme methane emissions that were not detected before, I mean, you can see here 3,000 ppm, that's like 50,000 milligrams per day, right? So orders of magnitude higher than what most ecologists study. And what we find is, especially over the Yedema regime, where the carbon is, the most carbon ice-rich Pleistocene deposits, we're finding that these fluxes during the winter are higher than 73 prior studies during the summer of similar littoral permafrost wetlands. And so the Yedema region in Yakutia in central Alaska is very carbon rich and is emitting a lot of methane. And so these are the kind of tools we're using to try to understand the larger contributions. And so I just wanted to give you one example of the method I'm developing. So this is a geophysical survey that I've done around the lake that I showed you. where these hot spots are being detected at the thaw margin. And before I did the geophysics, I spent, a year measuring every week these fluxes on this red transect. So you can see the T is just a distance transect from the lake to the permafrost upland over some distance, say 35 meters to 50 meters. And what you see in figure 1 is that you see this, the summation of these means are this exponential, right? It's the Euler function, right? It's amazing. And that's actually a reciprocal of the thaw gradients that we're seeing in the subsurface. So we were kind of baffled, why do we see these extreme fluxes at the thaw margins? Oh, well, there's a huge volume of unfrozen permafrost that represents a sort of methane conduit that's then escaping out of this thaw margin. And what's amazing is most models consider methane to be oxidized under lakes during the winter, but we're finding these emissions continue all winter long because they're actually escaping out the sides of these lakes. And this is due to hydrological changes in discontinuous permafrost. But, if you were to just put a temperature probe and measure the active layer, you would never understand that beneath the permafrost is actually large taliques. And so again, we're making these kind of false assumptions about just monitoring the active layer, when just a few more meters down, you have a completely unfrozen intrapermafrost talique. And these are very widespread. I just show you one example, but we find these in the North Slope, in the tundra, we find it in discontinuous permafrost. And so, yeah, we're learning a lot by new methods of geophysics, new methods of remote sensing, and we're sort of challenging a lot of assumptions. Here's another landmark study that came out in 2016 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. This found that 50% of the methane for the year happens during winter. Okay, so all models that you see, all IPCC reports, one, don't include permafrost carbon, period. The new updated reports only consider summer emissions, which is 3 or 4 months of the year. But this study shows over a multi-year study at 5 sites and using the same airborne methods that we use, that 50% of the emissions are during the cold season. And look, 12 trillion grams from just the tundra, that's half the budget from the top-down people. So obviously that can't be correct. And so we're breaking these old assumptions because people would kind of wave their hand and say, oh, well, there's no emissions during the winter. How could that be possible? Well, a lot of the permafrost taliques are not frozen in the winter because of the heat latency of water. And so this is from the tundra. This is the Alaskan Arctic. And another follow-up study did it on CO2 and found the winter CO2 loss is greater than the summer CO2 uptake. For a long period of time, people assumed, oh, the shrub growth and the Arctic greening, that's going to balance out the CO2 emissions from the permafrost. But just the contrary, winter CO2 loss is greater than summer CO2 uptake. And this is from less than 2 years ago. And we have a study, a 3-year study coming out later this year that shows the exact same thing, that 45% of all of the emissions in central Alaska, in the Yedema region, happen during the winter. And so this is a huge paradigm shift in the sense that we're essentially doubling our current inventory, which still hasn't been included. I think it will be included in the upcoming IPCC report. So a lot has changed since 2007, which is the 5th assessment report. And so just to kind of look ahead a little bit, this was a paper by Nisbon last year, showing just from Northeast Siberia and the ice-rich permafrost in Yakutia, that under the RCP 8.5, which is the current track we're on, just from Northeast Siberia, we're looking at 60 gigatons of carbon by 2100, which is about 6 years of human emissions. So you can see how we could miss our budget by not including this. However, there's hope here because they found that in their modeling that RCP 4.5 has a significantly less response to ice-rich permafrost. So there is some benefits of trying to alter our pathway on the 8.5, although I don't see how that is possible, but these are the kind of things we have to consider moving forward. And so there's kind of 3 major problems right now. One is the seasonality bias. I was kind of shocked over the last 4 years to learn that we're not measuring, barely anyone's measuring during the winter season because of how cold and dark and expensive it is. And, you know, people don't want to go out there when it's minus 30 Celsius. But we have, and we find that the emissions are very high. And so 95% of the permafrost carbon research occurs during summer, and we're underestimating annual emissions because of that. There's also a sampling bias, namely that 35% of all Arctic research occurs at 2 locations: Tulik, Alaska, which was a glaciated area of Alaska, and also Abisko, Sweden, which is a post-permafrost pulsa fen and bog. And that's because there's hot showers there, it's very convenient, there's great food, but really we need to get into the wilderness, we really need to get into places like central Yakutia and central Alaska, where the largest carbon reservoirs of permafrost are. So we have a sampling bias and a seasonality bias. And then of course I mentioned the scaling issue. The circumpolar permafrost is extremely remote. We need remote sensing. However, the remote sensing needs ground validation. And so this is where Russian scientists and institutes have a huge advantage. I think in the next 10 years, we'll have several climate satellites measuring methane emissions, but we'll need people on the ground to validate these models. I also think that the geophysics that I just showed you can be done on a large scale from remote sensing. So again, I think having people across Russia to ground validate this remote sensing is important. And so it's sort of in conclusion, it's interesting that the permafrost carbon feedback was first proposed in the early 90s by Zimov, and it's kind of come full circle back to Russia has to play a huge role in this because most of the carbon reservoirs are located in Russia. So this is a Russian science priority, I believe. And so over the next 4 years, I'll be going to Russia to develop this method and compare it with Alaska. And so I hope there's that ecosystem creates collaborations between us. And so, yeah, I look forward to seeing you there, and you're always welcome here in Alaska. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. I'm sure and I hope that there will be more collaborating and collaborative opportunities for you and for scholars that took part already in this seminar. And we have a question for you from one of the scholars, actually, from yesterday's panel. How do you think, is the carbon emission in winter is an important carbon source just for permafrost region or boreal zone as well?
That's a great question. It's very important that we understand the cold season emissions because most of the thermal changes are happening during winter, right? And so winter is where we're seeing a lot of the high emissions because it's weird this summer, because of the thermal lag of the heat latency of water, the summer heat peaks in the end of November in thermal karst lakes and in taliks. So methane is a logarithmic function of temperature and water saturation. So for every 1 C increase of permafrost carbon sediments, the microbes respond to a log 10 increase. So 1 C, 2 C, 3 C is a log 10 step up. It follows a linear trajectory, which is really nice to model. And so the late season is very important. November and December is actually getting the heat from the summer. And then it's reversed, early May is actually the winter. And so people are actually collecting records at the wrong periods. November, December, January, February are very important, especially from the boreal zone, which is where a lot of discontinuous permafrost is, where, the tundra continuous permafrost is not as high as emissions, but as I showed you, these winter emissions, the Zona PNAS paper, that was from the tundra, not the boreal zone. And so both the boreal and the tundra are emitting carbon and methane during the winter. And so all you have to do is go out there and take winter measurements, and they'll be huge. They're put it this way, you can make a lot of very popular papers right now if you go and measure during the winter. And so we're all very interested in winter measurements. So yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay. So, well, we have a question which will probably rather addressed to some of the Russian scholars. Do we know if Russia is ready to devote resources to conducting this scientific research that is needed? So if you have any Russian colleagues, they would probably be more qualified to answer that. So, okay, so thank you once again, Nicholas, for joining and for being with us throughout the whole panel. That's very brave of you. And we can move on to the very last report, for which we have, I think we have 4 of the 6 stated presenters. And if any of them can wave or turn on their videos. Yes, we have Klaus, hello. And yeah, so Nicholas, you can turn your screen sharing off. Thank you. Okay, Vladimir, Klaus, Ekaterina and Troy, are you with us? Mm-hmm.
I think we have most of the team here.
Yes, yeah, I see Troy again as well. And will Ekaterina be joining you?
No, I don't think so. I think I'm presenting on behalf of the team. So
okay, great. So I'll present the 3 of you then. Yes, because your report is the very last one. And thank you all for joining. At the very end of the panel, we're so happy that you made it. And so as far as I know, your report will be titled Global Permafrost Data Gaps, Impact to International Collaboration and National Security. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
Okay, so it will be presented by Klaus Dotz at Royal Holloway, University of London, Troy Bufar, University of Alaska Fairbanks, and Vladimir Romanovsky, University of Alaska Fairbanks. Okay, so your floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's hope this works. So, and then please tell me if I'm hoping if that works.
Yes, perfect.
Does that look okay?
Yeah, that looks fine.
Okay, so let me go. Hopefully it looks a little bit more elegant if I have it like that for you.
Oh,
okay, well, great. Well, thank you very much. As you can see, it's very much a team effort, and there are 6 members of the team listed here. and I have the pleasurable task of presenting on behalf of the team. I need a sort of health warning right at the start. I'm a political geographer. I am not a permafrost scientist. So unlike my distinguished colleague, presenter, who offered a really excellent overview of some of the exciting possibilities vis-a-vis permafrost science, I'm not in the position to do that, but I'm going to do my best to convey, I think, the spirit of what we wish to, in a sense, inform the audience. So a couple of things first. I think actually in some ways the ordering was interesting, because actually in some ways our presentation was a sort of scene setter, I think, for some of the more detailed technical concerns. But I think it's really important to mention some of these things, because one of the things that some of the audience might be asking themselves, why is a social scientist interested in permafrost, and how did we come together to create a sort of interdisciplinary presentation? Well, some of these things I think are obvious to those, of course, who live in the everyday consequences of permafrost thaw in particular, but they're worth reiterating. One of the reasons why we recognize that permafrost is so incredibly important is when it does thaw, when it does collapse and disintegrate, it has profound implications, not only for, as we heard earlier, in terms of methane emissions, for example, the release of pathogens, the destabilization of ground, but that destabilization also carries with it important consequences for infrastructure. And that infrastructure, of course, can be civilian, but as recent reports in Alaska reaffirm, even the military is also finding that permafrost thaw and disaggregation is costly and damaging. It also, I think, is really important to stress that permafrost thaw or destabilization carries with it important and enduring consequences for northern and indigenous communities all over the circumpolar Arctic, but particularly in Russia, Alaska, and Canada. But one of the key purposes of our presentation is to stress, I think, some of the exciting possibilities for further collaboration and information exchange, and what certainly I would think of as permafrost science diplomacy. One thing to note, however, again, I think it's quite interesting when you compare and contrast permafrost to, say, something like sea ice or glaciers, is we pose here whether permafrost is less charismatic and therefore gets less attention from global media and publications more generally about what changes in the Arctic and why it matters. In other words, you probably find a great many more news stories about disappearing sea ice or retreating glacier ice, and rather less about permafrost. And as the last speaker also presented, there is also an interesting kind of seasonality challenge to some of this as well. So much of that reporting, of that interest in the Arctic, has a kind of summer seasonality to it, which also I think can be quite misleading in terms of what we do know and don't know. So those of you who are familiar with permafrost will know only too well how it's defined and why its distribution matters. And as this rather elegant image on the right-hand side of the slide just reminds you, this is particularly important in terms of its distribution, that much of the permafrost we're interested in and we talk about is to be found in Russia, Alaska, Canada, as I alluded earlier. But as the previous presenter also made clear, which chimes with us as well, our information and our knowledge about permafrost is patchy. And I think this is one of the sort of key areas or concerns about going forward in terms of what we do know and don't know, and how we are able to sensibly model future change in the light of these information gaps, some of which of course just may be seasonal, as mentioned earlier, but some of it may be geographical in terms of where researchers have access to and where they don't. The damage, as I alluded to earlier, is really very profound and ongoing. And I think one of the costs that is becoming increasingly less hidden is the cost due to permafrost thawing. And that cost will run into billions of dollars and rubles over the coming decades. And that will, of course, throw into sharp juxtaposition the kind of visions that leaders might have for further resource and economic-led development in the Arctic when juxtaposed against this ongoing costs that will be undoubtedly have to be factored into any calculations, as I say, over the coming decades. For some members of the team, of course, this has been a really long-standing area of concern in terms of trying to make sense in terms of what exactly is the impact, both in the here and now and the future, of permafrost thawing, but also emissions. And so I think one of the pleasures of working in this team is learning more about the extraordinary research that goes on in, as I say, those three particular places where permafrost is found. Some of the members of the team also have looked at how permafrost thaw and degradation also, I think, further compounds a sense of hazards and hazard management in the Arctic. So, for example, one of the things that I think we're increasingly learning, and this is where, for example, Northern and Indigenous storytelling has also played a crucial role in reminding us that permafrost thaw does not occur in splendid isolation, that it often then leads on to a whole series of other things that then indeed can have positive feedback loops vis-a-vis permafrost. So some of the things that, for example, the Bering Sea Elders group in Alaska have made clear is that with permafrost thaw comes landslides, and then on top of that, you've also got to factor in coastal erosion that places further pressure on infrastructures and settlements that in themselves are already vulnerable to ongoing change. So there is, in a sense, a real urgency to a lot of this work. And if the previous speaker again talked quite rightly about patchiness, well, we can also just highlight briefly some models of good practice that actually might give us some hope. So we know, for example, where there have been quite exciting opportunities for data sharing and international collaboration, whether it's involving the oceans or whether it's been involving particular disciplines. Such as seismology. Some of this, of course, has become undoubtedly a great deal easier in the post-Cold War era. And indeed, that's one of the things that I think we just have to absolutely acknowledge. In many, many parts of the world, and the Arctic certainly was not immune to this, data sharing, of course, carried with it very, very important geopolitical and military sensitivities. It really did matter in terms of whether you could get access to particular places. And that wasn't indeed a fact of life that many Western scientists were not able, for example, to visit the Soviet Union and vice versa. There were periods of collaboration and exchange, but they were limited. So that brings us on to permafrost is an interesting example of international collaboration. It's worth noting the International Permafrost Association was created in 1983. So for all the talk of the Second Cold War and the worsening of US-Soviet relations in particular, there are some important counterpoints to that dominant narrative of where states were able to collaborate. The Polar Bear Agreement of 1973, of course, a decade earlier, again is a reminder that Arctic states have often found opportunities to work with one another, even if the prevailing geopolitics was difficult. One of the things we think is really striking and something to watch going forward is the role of non-Arctic states. This is, of course, carries with it its own set of sensitivities, but it is really worth strikingly, I think, poignant to note that China is increasingly an important element in the sort of globalization of permafrost science, and particularly through its long-standing interest and occupation of Tibet, has generated considerable expertise, not only in terms of permafrost science, but also cold weather engineering. And note that the 12th International Conference on Permafrost will indeed be hosted in China in 2022. That was delayed, of course, because of the pandemic, but it's a reminder that permafrost science is a global area of concern. The other area that I think we just want to acknowledge and sort of take into account, thinking about data gaps and knowledge generation, is, of course, there is a longer history to be told about permafrost science. I'm not going to go through this slide because I don't have the time, but it is simply to note there are ideas of permafrost have evolved and changed, and that permafrost really right from the very start has been a transnational area of inquiry with particular strands, whether it's German, whether it's Russian, whether it's American, whether it's Chinese, contributing to this field. And again, note one of the really interesting areas that echoes sea ice research was the extraordinary importance of translation, the translation of Russian language materials into English, and then in a sense, the start of further diffusion and exchange and hybridization of permafrost science. So it's been a really interesting and indeed fascinating story of how these different language, scientific traditions have coexisted with one another and built and learned from one another. A couple of final things that we wanted to draw your attention to. One is we're interested in what we call here the sharing economies of permafrost science. So I've already alluded to that backstory, that longer history of translation and hybridization, but also to make the point about where it has been possible to do permafrost science and where it's been harder to, or for example, where permafrost scientists have been able to gather and work with one another. Hence the importance of the International Permafrost Association for trying to bridge those possibilities of collaborative science. We think finally that there are both challenges and opportunities here. On the one hand, I think it's really important that permafrost thawing and emissions acts as a kind of reality check, as we put here, to some of the endless stories that often want to emphasize things like scrambles for the Arctic, new Cold Wars. I mean, there is a sort of another dimension to all of this, which is simply a whole series of Arctic communities coping with ongoing and intensifying climate change, and permafrost thaw is surely part and parcel of that. Secondly, if we are to speak intelligently going forward in terms of permafrost trends, then we do need to think about all those areas that will need to be enhanced in terms of permafrost monitoring. There are huge data gaps that, again, the previous speaker alluded to, that just simply deserve to be tackled. There are some areas of optimism, and I think it's worth just reiterating to end on. One is that just a reminder that under the auspices of the Arctic Council, we did of course have the 2017 so-called Fairbanks Agreement on scientific collaboration. And I think that was a considerable achievement given some of the difficulties involving US, Russian, EU relationships. And that secondly, I think we need to look further in terms of how we do indeed encourage and facilitate that data sharing and knowledge generation, and actually how we work across a sort of circumpolar network of science and how that data is shared. And that also means, of course, we need to be attentive to other geopolitical dimensions. The China-Russia relationship is often talked about mainly in the light of energy opportunities and shipping and transport. But it may well be interesting to see how, for example, permafrost engineering becomes increasingly an area of common concern and all that might bring with it. So let me end there. I hope I haven't taken up too much time, but just simply to say, for those who are less familiar with permafrost, if there is anybody less familiar in this distinguished audience, there are some wonderful resources where you can actually find more about how permafrost is mapped and surveyed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation, for your group effort. This report is actually quite consonant to the one we had in the previous panel by Alexei Maslakov from the Lomonosov Moscow State University, who went over quite a detailed description of how permafrost thawing affects the Bering Strait communities, the coastal communities in Chukotka. And he's been working on that for quite a long time. And the impact is drastic, really. So I think he would be really interested also in collaborating with your team. And in general, as I've mentioned already several times today, that we will be publicizing the narrative report about this event later on the Fulbright.ru website, and providing thus more space for the panelists and for the attendees to connect with each other and follow up with each other on their common and shared topics of interest. Are there any questions from other participants to Klaus or maybe to his colleagues? Joel? No questions?
I don't have any questions. I'm just really, frankly, kind of overwhelmed and actually Professor Dodds, you mentioned maybe it would have been better to have you come as a start, but I think at an end as a keynote speech, I think this was really what we were looking for. I mean, you've pointed out so many areas of interest, and I became aware of when I started here as the Fulbright Program Director in 2013. I was so excited that we had a person from the University of Alaska Fairbanks went to Yakutia and to study permafrost. And this gentleman also had a short music video where he dressed up as the Tunnel Man, almost like a Superman suit. And, it was kind of silly and kind of fun, but comments have been made earlier about the importance of engaging younger audiences. And I've been thinking about this a lot based on some of the things that have happened today, some of the things that have been said. And I do think that there's these huge gaps of information that's not being shared. And, for the Fulbright program, we see this as part of our mission, and we want to do more and more. And we're hoping we're going to get a lot of feedback from this group about how we can help. One thing we all can do is tell people about the Fulbright program so that they can participate. And we would love to have people coming to Russia or Russians going to the United States to get training, either as, say, student researchers or as scholars. So there's that, and this idea that permafrost science diplomacy hasn't maybe gotten the attention that it should is something I think that we can really build on. And recently, for example, I was on the phone or in a Zoom call actually with a filmmaker who's working with a Fulbright alum, Georgy Molodtsov, on a 3D project whereby they're basically building almost a museum that students can visit either with their laptops or preferably with these 3D lenses or glasses, and they can explore together research findings, as well as cultural exhibits, say in this sort of for Lake Baikal, but I see how that could easily transfer over to the Arctic as a way to exhibit to young people using, say, the best techniques of the visualization of data. How do you say that in Russia? Изображение данных, that might help young people become inspired by the sort of research that you all are doing. As I hear these estimates of when we're really going to start feeling the major effects of climate change, I'm a bit embarrassed to think, or I do the math thinking, am I going to be dead then or not? But then what about my kids? And then what about their grandkids? And so, the incentive to get the youth involved is huge. And I can only compliment all of you on the leadership that you're showing. And the humility and the energy that you're applying to this. It's not even important. It's so far beyond importance. I don't even know how to describe. And so after this set of presentations, I'm excited to see that we have our best and brightest working on these things, but the lift is so heavy. And
but can I just say, if I may, I concur with everything you've said. Sorry, I should make that clear. One of the exciting things I think is, and I don't know what other colleagues think as well, is that, there are these immense opportunities in terms of creative storytelling. So, for example, we've had in the British context, we have a national mapping agency called ESRI. And they produce these beautiful participatory, what's called story mapping. And I like your point about the visualization, because one of the things that permafrost lends itself well to, counterintuitively, because after all, so much of it is either we don't see or is underground or in obscure places, but you can visualize beautifully the active layer, for example, and really, really give students a sense of what a kind of, in some ways, a beautifully complex substance or this is, but at the same time also how extraordinarily important it is when it thaws, when it breaks down, and everything else that follows. So yes, I agree with you. I think visualization, storytelling. I also remember the Alaskan Superman, which was a really fun piece of sort of creative storytelling. I think we do need more, frankly.
I may also add to that. I think social media and the accessibility of news, global news and information also makes it a little bit, maybe accelerates the interest in this, globally important issues among, well, people who have nothing to do with science in general. So we hear, as for the permafrost thawing, I think it's mostly like a source for scary stories coming from Yakutia about permafrost thawing and, like anthrax releasing, or some carcasses of prehistoric mammals being discovered full of, like pathogens and microorganisms. And I see a lot of those comments like, oh, leave them be, don't touch them. Oh, something like, oh, you see how climate change brings this about. So people, and especially young people, are very quickly aware of the implications that brings. So it's also one of the bonuses of news traveling so quickly and people getting all this information. Like a thawing of ice has recently been popularized again with this news about this polar bear that drifted on the ice into Ireland. So, all the way from the Arctic. So I think these creative stories, again, just like real life stories, they also bring awareness to general people who are not involved at all in this, on a larger scale. They're just observants. But then, you become involved and you become interested because these are real life implications of all these global issues.
I think those are all great points. And, I would just to add, the term science diplomacy, another term I've learned recently, because I interview people who are applying for fellowships, is science journalism. And it's probably partly due to the COVID pandemic, but just this year I never even heard of or thought of it this way, journalism, but more and more we're getting applicants for the Fulbright program for people who want to conduct science journalism, which I think is a really important thing in terms of like science diplomacy, because these journalists are able to put things into terms that lay people can understand and then be active about. Because, and as you made a great point, we're hearing all these things about the battle over the Arctic, and journalists often tend to like to have these kind of stories because, we read them and we're so frightened and it gets our attention. But there's also a lot of good work that can be done to demonstrate how, despite maybe, Russia U.S. relations being worse than they've ever been in my lifetime right now, we still have many things that we can do that are very politically neutral, but as far as the planet's survival is concerned, absolutely vital. And we can all make that choice to do those things now. And so, I must say, I feel a lot of gratitude for all of you for responding to our request to join this forum. And we would really appreciate your feedback and your criticism, because we need your guidance to know how we can help and whether we should continue with a forum like this. Maybe we should break it into different subgroups. We can do any of these things. As I said, Marshall McLuhan from University of Toronto, my alma mater, did say the medium is the message. And maybe in a sense that's true, because we're seeing so much that people, because we have these great opportunities to connect through the internet, to actually make contributions. And as Ksenia said, sometimes it's not even scientific experts, but it's just the mass of observations can be, I think that they can be used to get good direction. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you, Joel. Thank you to all the panelists today for staying. Some of you have stayed with us from the very beginning, and we appreciate that a lot. And we appreciate, of course, everyone who joined in later. I think at this note, we can probably wrap up the seminar. And again, just to highlight that this event has been part of the ongoing series of events dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright program all over the world. And we hope that it contributed to establishing the dialogue and contributing to furthering the cooperation between the scientists and researchers, and, well, in different souls all over the world, towards more productive and more effective networking, and in general, just working towards improving life on our planet. And of course, the academic dialogue as well, which is the Fulbright program has always been doing, right? Academic exchange, scientific cooperation, these have always been our priorities. So thank you once again to all participating. We will publicize all the materials and we have, as well as the videos. And we hope you will join us in our next events that will be planned and publicized as well. So thank you all for being with us, for joining, for presenting, for sharing your research. We hope to see you again, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.